I don't know. I think we got a lot of determination on display this morning already. This is good. So as I was putting this one together, I was reminded of, sometimes the best lessons we get are from our kids and our grandkids or kids that we know. And I was reminded this time a couple of years ago. Every summer, my wife would get my daughter, and my son, even though he's too cool for it now, my daughter like a big thing to put in the backyard that's like inflates and shoots water out of it, for those like really hot days. And a couple of years ago, she got her this like unicorn one here she is. And the water like shoots out of the tip of the unicorn's like corn? Horn. Sure. Which is kind of weird if you think about it, but she really enjoyed it, and she was into unicorns at the time, as most kids are, and she liked it, and so we had it in the backyard. And then one day, she texted me, and she's like, can I take the unicorn to my friend's house? And I was like, wasn't thinking much, I was busy. And I'm like, well, that's going to be a lot of work, honey, because you have to take it, get it, and deflate it, and take it down there and inflate it back up again. She's like, oh, we'll figure it out. I'm like, sure, whatever. Did not think much of it. And then a little bit thereafter, happened to be heading down the street very near where this friends were. And this is what I saw on the side of the road. I got a picture of it. They were determined to get that unicorn to where it needed to go, but obviously decided that deflating it and inflating it was just too much work. And I love that picture. And I'm like, someday I'm going to be able to use that picture. And here we are today. Because if that isn't like, 8-year-old girl determination, I don't know what it is. But that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about this idea of determination and what that looks like. And we're doing it using the story of Ruth. Now, we actually did a whole sermon series a couple of years ago on Ruth where we went through the whole thing. If you weren't here for that and are interested, you go back and listen to that. It's on our website. So we're not going to do the whole story again, but just give you a little reminder of what's going on here at the beginning of the story. There's a couple of main characters in this. The two main characters in the story, in the part of the story we have, is Ruth and her mother-in-law, Naomi. Now, Naomi is an Israelite. She is from, one of the tribes, one of the Jewish tribes, but had to leave her part of the country because there was a famine. If you didn't notice, all throughout the Bible, people are having to leave because of famines, because they used to be much more common. And she goes to Moab, and while she's there, she has her and her husband, and they have 2 sons, and their sons actually marry Moabite women, so women who are not basically Israelite, they're not Jews. And this happened. And over time, while they're there in Moab, some things happen. First off, Naomi's husband dies, leaving her a widow, which is not good in this time and place. And then eventually, both of her sons pass away as well, leaving their 2 wives, Ruth and Orpah, as widows as well. Around then, or shortly thereafter, Ruth finds out that the famine in her previous, where she was before, is actually over. So she decides at this point it's probably time just to go home, be near her family and her people, hoping they would help take care of her. And so she leaves to do that. And at first, the daughter-in-laws decide to go with her. And they get a little ways away. And then Naomi figures out this probably isn't the best thing for them. Right? She's going home because there's this understanding that if you're a widow, that the rest of your family will help take care of you if they are, in fact, your family. So she's doing that, and she's fairly convinced that for Ruth and Orpah, it would be better if they went back to their home. They're still young, or at least younger. They could still have kids. They have a lot better chance of finding another husband, and think what you will about that, but it was, 2,500 years ago, and that's how the world worked. So she have a better chance finding a husband back in their own place with their own family. And Orpah agrees. And so Orpah's like, you know what, that probably is right. So she decides to go. And by the way, in case you didn't know this little tidbit, Oprah Winfrey was originally supposed to be called Orpah, but her mom misspelled it. That is a true story. She tells it herself. Anywho, that's not one of those biblical names you hear all that often, Orpah, but you could, I suppose. And Ruth decides to do something different. And so the scripture we have today is Ruth telling her mother-in-law that she says, no, I am going to go with you. Your people will then become my people, and I will go where you will go. And I like that line at the end, because Naomi has been trying to convince her otherwise. And at the end, she said, of what we read, she says, seeing that Ruth was determined to go with her, she decides, okay, and then they set off together. Ruth was determined to go with Naomi. She was determined despite the fact that she didn't know where she was going. She'd never been there. She'd never been to that part of the world. These weren't her people. And outside of her now mother-in-law, she doesn't have any family. But she feels this connection, this kinship, and this loyalty to Naomi and decides to go anyway. And just, even though knowing it would be hard, that it would be difficult, probably more difficult than going home, but she chooses to go anyway with Naomi, even though she doesn't know how it's going to turn out. I think oftentimes when we think about the idea of determination, we think about it in terms of people who hike mountains, climb mountains, or run marathons. Two things I'm never going to do, right? I have a really good friend. We were actually pastors together back in Ohio at the same time. He had this goal and dream to run the Boston Marathon, which apparently is really hard to do because you have to qualify for it. And I think last weekend, he actually got to run the Boston Marathon for the first time, right? It took him, 15 years, right? To go from running his first marathon to qualifying for the Boston Marathon, right? Because he had that goal in mind. And I texted him, I said, I'm so proud of you. That's amazing. I will never do that. I'm glad you did. But that's often what we think about when we think about determination. We think about things, yes, they're hard, yes, they're difficult, right? But there is an end goal in mind, right? You want to run the race, you want to get to the top of the mountain, you want to get the promotion, you want to get, done with school, whatever it is. Oftentimes, when we think of what it is to have determination, we think about it in terms of the finish line is over there, and I want to get from here to there. Now, that does take determination, especially when the road gets hard. Especially when it takes longer than you want it to, or more energy or effort than it wants it to. But there is another form of determination that is probably a little bit more prevalent for most of us. And that's the determination that we need to keep going, keep putting the effort in, keep putting the energy in, when we don't actually know where things are going to lead and how it's going to work out. Ruth, the next time we hear from Ruth in the story after she travels home, which no doubt took a long time, is that in order to feed her and Naomi, she actually takes about gleaning in the fields, which basically is this practice of after the harvesters go through the fields, it's Jewish custom and tradition that after all the harvesters take everything that they take from it, people who are in need can go and follow after them and take the little bits of leftovers. And in fact, there's this expectation that you'll actually leave a little bit behind if you're the owner of the field, so those can go behind you and do that. This is hard, hot, excruciating work. That is the next place we will find Naomi, and that's how she and Ruth, and this is how Ruth and Naomi survive in the time to come. We all have times in our lives when we need to practice determination, when we need to practice the keeping going, even when going is hard. One of this was the Oxford Dictionary, defines determination as the ability to keep trying to do something, although it is difficult. I think we can all think of times when we needed to keep trying to do something, even though it was difficult. When we do that, we are practicing determination, something that God often asks us to do and that life requires us to do. Sometimes it is easier when we know where the finish line is, though I think most of the time in life, the time of determination we have to practice is the kind where we don't actually know where the finish line is, and we just have to keep going and keep trying anyway. All right. If any of you have ever spent any time doing any editing or like, laying out, if anybody's like on the school newspaper or done anything like that, you've probably run into something. There's this basic little sample blocks of text that you use when you're laying things out. And those sample blocks of text are usually called lorem ipsum, right? Are people familiar with these? Like you go to, you see a little block of text and you want to see how the text all works together, right? So what you can do is there's this well-established selection of words that don't literally look like they mean anything, right? Because that's not the point, right? The point is to give you a random block of text that won't distract you from doing all of the like page layout stuff that you need to do. And it's mostly mostly we understand that if you don't, of course we all speak Latin, so we know that's Latin. Right. Yeah, sure. Which, of course, that's why we do it in Latin, right? It looks like our words, but we don't read it, because none of us do. And that's what you use it for. Now, this actually dates, the idea of lorem ipsum and the original version of it actually dates to about 1500. And nobody quite knows where it came from. And for the longest time, that it was understood that to be just some random texts, right? Nobody really knew where it came from or really cared until some bored academic who needed a project to work on in the age of computers decided to try to figure it out. And what this guy did is he fed all of the standard lorem ipsum text into a computer along with a database of all these other texts and asked the computer to figure out where did this come from. Well, it turns out that what lorem ipsum is actually kind of a scrambling up of different phrases from a writing from Cicero, who was writing in 45 BC. Or really a Latin translation of Cicero, who was writing in 45 BC. So that's actually where it comes from, and it's actually a poem, if you could read it, but it's actually a poem now in the wrong order because it got all mangled up and messed up because this person just needed some random texts. Now you're thinking, why are you telling me all this? That's interesting, Jeremy. Maybe I'll bring it up at a cocktail party, but I don't know why I care. Well, let me tell you, and I'm going to surprise you a little bit, because it has to do, the reason you care is also the reason you care is because this actually has something to do with the Irish, believe it or not. So one of the things that happens between 45 BC, when Cicero writes this, and 1500, where it gets scrambled up into this default text that we use today, well, there's a lot of things that happen. One of the things that happens is Cicero was writing this during the time of the Roman Empire. And of course, the Romans were really good at a lot of things. They were really good at doing stuff. They were good at writing things down. They had a lot of philosophers and things like that. But around like 400 AD, there starts to be some problems. And the problems start to be is that the Roman Empire really is collapsing at that point and being consistently and constantly invaded. And really, most of what we know as Western Europe between like the 4th and the 7th century will be invaded over and over and over again by Germanic tribes and different groups. And really, what we really see in that scenario is really the fall of the Roman Empire that we talk about. Well, one thing that happens when Rome falls, which of course takes a while, is that a lot of things get destroyed. Right? We're lucky to have as much as we have of Roman buildings and stuff because a lot of it was destroyed. And one of the things that was destroyed over and over and over again were the libraries. Rome was famous. It had a lot of libraries. And when people would invade, one of the things that the invaders wanted to do really was not only just like take over the people, but also sort of eliminate the culture. And one of the ways you eliminate culture is you take away the libraries. Right? And so between the 4th century and the 7th century, really throughout Western Europe, most of the writings that we had before that were destroyed. So much so that it would be very plausible today for us to not actually have a lot of the things that we have. And it'd be very possible today that we wouldn't have the philosophers and the ancient philosophers and everything that then get rediscovered later in what we would call the Renaissance. Except for one place. Now, around 400 AD, there is a guy who was born called Pancraeus. Sure. Kind of looks like pancreas, but I know it's not that. Patakrius, and he's a Briton from the British Isles, and he's part of Britain that is part of the Roman Empire at that time, though it's about not to be. The Romans are just about to leave, but he's from Britain, that is part of the Roman Empire, and he's from there. But somewhere early in childhood, he actually gets captured, and he actually gets captured by Irish raiders. Now, the Irish at this time on their island were not part of the Roman Empire. England the Isle of Britain is about as far as the Romans got, and they didn't even make it all the way up, right? So Ireland was always on its own. So he actually gets captured by Irish raiders, lives for a long time in slavery in Ireland. Eventually does get to go back home. When he gets back home to Britain, he actually becomes a priest, and then returns to Ireland and takes on Ireland as his missionary field. Now, we don't know him as Patakrius, which is good. What we know him as is St. Patrick. So St. Patrick comes to Ireland, and he really continues to be today, obviously the patron saint of Ireland, and really is the one who brought Christianity and the Christian faith to Ireland, and does a lot of things. One of the things that he does is he sets up a lot of monasteries. And in fact, by the year 600, the Irish will have more monasteries and more monks per capita than anywhere else. Now, one thing you got to know, if you're going to run a monastery, right, and you're going to have all these monks around, you need to give them something to do. So a popular thing to give monks to do is to have them be the ones who actually copy down and make copies of all of the texts. Because this is 1,000 years before Gutenberg, right? There is no printing press, there is no printer, there are no smartphones, none of that exists. If you have something written down, it's because somebody sat there and wrote it down by hand. And if you have a copy of something, you have a copy of something because somebody had one copy and made another of it, again, by hand. One of the things that the Irish are really interested in was learning and knowledge. So right at the time when the Western world is being invaded and the Roman Empire is collapsing, the Irish are actually sending people out to gather all of the books and all of the knowledge they can find to bring it back to Ireland. Ireland itself is never really invaded. It never really goes through the problems that the rest of the Western world does. So for several centuries, the Irish are there, diligently copying their books with all of their monks who need something to do when they're not brewing beer, which is the other thing the monks do. Sure. And I sometimes think about this. It's one of those things that you know, and I know, and we've all probably knew that this happened because we all knew that there was a time before the printing press, and yet we still had books and somebody had to copy them. But if you think about it, really think about it. Obviously one of the things they were copying was the Bible. Take out any Bible and start copying it by hand. How long is that going to take you? For me, really long, because my penmanship stinks. And even if I did it, you wouldn't be able to read it when I was done, so I'm not sure what the point would be. But even if you're practiced at it, even if you know how to do it, right? You're not doing it with a really nice ballpoint pen either, right? You're doing it probably with a feather and an inkwell and all that sort of stuff. And so for not only days or months, but one book, especially something like the Bible, would represent years in the life of one person just to write the text down, to say nothing of all the really nice little pretty pictures they put in there. And if you think about it, the Irish, not only did they go and make sure that all the religious texts that they knew and cared about, all the Christian texts they knew and cared about were copied down and preserved, they also went and copied down and preserved the works of Aristotle, the works of Plato, and the works of Cicero. They recognized that that knowledge was important too, and they wanted to make sure that they had access to it. So later, in the centuries to come, after say, after the transition of the first millennium, we start getting into the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, all of the books, nearly all of the books that they have at that point throughout Europe and really eventually throughout the world will be copies or copies of books that the Irish saved. Somebody several years ago wrote a great book called How the Irish Saved Civilization. And truly, in many ways, they did. Because if they had not done what they did, Most of what we have and understand today as ancient literature and ancient wisdom and all the ancient philosophers, we probably wouldn't have. It would have been lost to time. And the reason we have it is because a bunch of people who we will never know, a bunch of names we will never hear, a bunch of faces we will never see, spent years and years and years copying down painstakingly from old tattered copies into new copies, only to probably have future generations have to do the same thing again. That is a unique and special form of determination. If you think about it, what it must be to sit there on that first day, be handed this 6-inch thick book, and said, here is your work for the next 5 years. You're going to sit in this spot, you're going to work on this book, you're going to sit at this table, and sun up to sundown, you're going to copy letter by letter, word by word, line by line. Imagine the determination it takes to look at that and go, okay, I can do that. And at that time, and at that moment, what they thought they were doing was making another copy of a book. They didn't even know what we know now. They didn't even have the perspective that we have now, that not only were they copying a book, but they were in fact saving knowledge. Knowledge that everything that would come after was built on. The truth is, we don't always know what the byproduct of our work will be. We don't always know what the end result will be, because sometimes the end result will come not only years later, but perhaps even centuries later. It takes a special kind of determination to keep going, to keep doing the thing that is hard, when you don't even necessarily know what the finish line is or where it will be. That is the kind of determination that actually I think God is calling us to have. The ability and the willingness to keep going and doing the hard thing, not because we expect a reward at the end, not because we know what the reward at the end will be, but to keep doing the hard thing because it is the thing that God called us to do. I think if anybody knows about this more than anybody else, it's Ruth. Ruth's story is short, it's 4 little chapters, it comes very quick, and we can lose sight of the fact that it actually takes place over years and years and years. Yes, at the end of the story, spoiler, she and Boaz will get together and there'll be a happy moment where she has a baby at the end, which is what we probably was after in the first place. Again, 2,500 years ago, deal with it. But the space between here and there took a lot of work. It was no doubt very difficult, and the outcome was uncertain. Because really what she was trying to do when she was gleaning in the fields, and if you read the story, it's her, the strength she shows in gleaning the fields that attracts the attention of Boaz in the first place. But that's not what she's after. She's just trying to feed herself and feed Naomi. Ruth has a very special and important form of determination in much the way that we are called to have today. And I don't know that there's a group of people today that better understand this sort of determination to keep doing the hard thing even though you don't necessarily know where it's going to go. I don't know there's a group that probably understands that better today than our teachers do. If you think about it, you've got a group of kids maybe for a year. You pour your heart and your love and your soul into them. You do all that you can to help them live and grow and experience something new and learn what they can. And then you have to let them go. Let the next person take over while you start over again with that next group of kids. And what you have and the hope that you have and the thing that keeps you going and the thing that keeps you determined is your hope and faith that at the end of the day, it's going to work out well for most, if not all of them. Every time I go downstairs to the preschool we have here, and I watch the hard work that goes into those kids, and sometimes the exacerbated sighs I hear from now and then, but always followed by, but I love that guy or gal. And I think that kind of determination to keep going, the ability to keep doing the hard things when you don't know, is probably the most faithful and the kind of determination God calls us to have. So you may not always know what's happening. You may not always know where things are going to go. You may have some hard work in front of you that you hope is going to work out, but you're not sure. And when we have those moments, we're faced with a question: do you keep going? Do we keep persisting even though things get hard? Or do we just decide to give up and stop? The kind of determination God calls us to have is a determination that says, I understand this is not in my hands, it's in fact in someone else's. But I'm going to continue to do the hard things I'm called to do. I'm continue to work through it. I'm going to continue to try. I'm going to continue to challenge myself and challenge others. Because Ruth did it, and the Irish monks did it, and because they did it, we get to be here. Because one of the most interesting things about Ruth is if you look in the genealogy of Jesus that you find in the gospel, there are actually only 4 mothers listed. Ruth is one. Ruth becomes, even though she's not one of God's people, even though she's not from Israel, she's not a Jew, Ruth becomes Jesus' great times 12 grandmother. Because she was determined to do what she felt called to do, even though she didn't know where it was going. And because of that, we get to be here today. So, as we will be doing every week this series, I'm going to ask you now, how do you feel you are? How do you feel you rate when it comes to determination? Do you feel you're a very determined person? Do you feel you're able to get up and face the challenges of the day even though you don't know where the day is going to go? Do you feel like this is a strength from yours? You are allowed and encouraged through this process to claim your strengths. That is what we are after. And while I cannot pretend to know everything about everyone here, what I can tell you, that it is my belief, knowing most of you as well as I know you, that this is probably one of those places where we as a group will represent ourselves well. We have constantly demonstrated in this church our willingness to continue to go and continue to strive and continue to do the hard things. So I invite you, if you've got a device with you or whatever, you can find the poll any number of places. If you've got the app, it's under surveys, it's on johnstown.church/poll, wherever it is. It's one question. Where do you rate yourself? How do you think about yourself? Do you feel you have the kind of determination that God calls us to have? Maybe we're not all where we want to be yet, and that's fine too. But I'm going to tell you right now, I've been around this long enough. I've been here for almost 5 years, if you can believe that. And the one thing I know and trust about this place is that when things get hard, we do not run. When things get hard, we keep going. Amen.